Before we start my Singapore project, I'd like to thank my film director, Jonathan Bowen. Let's get into a little history of Singapore. The first written history of Singapore goes all the way back to the 3rd century. But Singapore is best known for getting its start as a trading post established by the British when the British were expanding their trade routes vastly in the late 18th century to India and China. And by the late 19th century, Singapore became an export center of the world for rubber. Singapore finally became an independent country on August 9, 1965. And then on December 22nd, 1965, it became a republic. Let's move on to the CSR efforts of Singapore. In Singapore, they believe that if you combine idea A and idea B, you have a better outcome than if you just go with idea A or idea B. And this is what keeps Singapore's image of a successful country going. Singapore has a very high power index of 74. The power index is defined as the lower powerful members of the society and in the country, except that the power is distributed unequally. The power index is so high because the government has a huge influence on everything. The Singapore government has adopted the 5 shared values, and the first one being nation before community and society above all. Singapore is a very excellent but still developing in their CSR efforts. One of the biggest factors being, is for the government and their hefty fines that they put on everything. Now, the economy is growing very much and very well just because of this fines, because both the companies and the citizens are aware of these fines and don't want them. It is known as the Fine City, and that is not meant in a good way. With the government being so fine happy, like I said before, the businesses and also the citizens have to be aware of what they're doing on an everywhere basis on their environment and everyone else's. With that being said, CSR is a new concept for Singapore, as 10 years ago it was an unknown concept, and businesses have lately seen the benefits of those who adopt CSR and have followed suit. Let's go to Singapore versus USA. So for this, I used the Hofstede website to show me the power index, and it's not shown here, but the power index, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. And as we talked about before, the power index of Singapore is very high, and then they understand that there's a hierarchy, and the people of lower power respect the people of higher power. In the US, it is rated a good 40, so it's a happy medium, but the people of lower power are always looking for more. In the individual aspect, Singapore scores a 20, which is not a very high score because Singapore is a very group-oriented and they don't want to hurt the image of the group or the family. In Singapore, children are taught from an early age to never think about just themselves and to think about their family more than just themselves. In the USA, this is completely opposite. The US scores a high score of 91 in individualism. And they are always worrying about themselves, and I can attest to this because I mostly worry about myself. Singapore, in masculinity aspect, scores a good score of 84. They want to be successful and competitive, but not as much as the US, who scores a score of 62. And they just want to be better than the person next to them. And again, I can attest to this because that's what I want to do every day. In uncertainty avoidance, Singapore scores an 8 in this dimension. In Singapore, people not abide by the rules because it's for the structure, but because of the high power index. In Singapore, they're known for the fine city. They just never want to get a fine for anything. And the US scores a lot higher with a 46, but still pretty low compared to a lot of other countries. But compared to Singapore, they are more accepting to new ideas without knowing the outcome. In long term, Singapore scores a high score of 72 and are always looking towards the future and how the things will affect them in the long run. Unlike the United States, where they are more worried about the now and worry about the consequences later, and they score a low 26. As stated in the Hofstede website, Singapore's indulgence, and I quote, was not possible to determine a preference on this dimension because Singapore's intermediate score of a 46. So that's all I got on that. I'm going to move on to the religion of Singapore. Singapore is a very rare country when it comes to religion. And they are a multi-religious nation, and Singapore is a living example that people with diverse backgrounds can coexist peacefully while each person practices its own religion. In fact, freedom of religion is in Singapore's constitution and one of the nation's top priorities. From a very early age, Singapore children are brought up to participate in harmony outreach programs to understand others' customs and practices. Singapore is home to 10 different religions, with the main religions being Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity. But the most practiced religion in Singapore is Buddhism, with 2/5 of the country practicing this religion. Some religious holidays that are celebrated in Singapore are the Lunar New Year, which begins on the first day of the new moon after the English New Year, and it lasts for 15 days as the full moon arrives. Family, friends, and companies exchange cards, gifts, and other items of symbolic meaning, such as Mandarin origins for this. Another thing that is celebrated in Singapore is Christmas, and with this coming up, I would like to tell everyone to have a good and safe holidays this week.